So I think you need to kind of realize that there is this real suffering going on among low-income Americans. And it's not just white Americans. It's not a white working class problem, you know. The Democratic Party don't have a white working class problem. They have a working class problem. And that's a crucial difference.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. In this episode, I'm interviewing someone with first-hand knowledge of the replacement of democracy with an authoritarian populist regime. What does this mean? Take, for example, the case of Hungary under the leadership of Viktor Orban, the populist prime minister since 2010. In the year 2022, the European Parliament declared that Hungary could no longer be considered a functional democracy. Members of Parliament are concerned about several political areas concerning democracy and fundamental rights in Hungary. They're worried about constitutional and electoral system, independence of the judiciary, corruption, conflicts of interest, and freedom of expression, including media pluralism, academic freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the right to equal treatment, including LGBTIQ rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees are all problematic. In this episode, I want to investigate what the first steps toward authoritarianism look like from the perspective of a country who's experienced that, and what we can do to avoid following the same path. Why do people want to go away from democracy? Are they racist bigots? No, I don't think so. The Hungarian government discourages public involvement in election oversight through intimidating rhetoric, and that elections are operated without the presence of opposition or nonpartisan observers. How did Hungary get into this situation? Well, I have on my show today someone who has experienced it and can talk to us about what it feels like, what they think can be done to counter it. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View. Come chat with me. Gabor Scheiring is a former member of the Hungarian Parliament, having served from 2010 to 2014, and an assistant professor of comparative politics at Georgetown University, Qatar. He previously served as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Center for European Studies. His research explores the political economy and lived experiences of contemporary economic transformations through quantitative, qualitative, and comparative methods. He focuses on how economic shocks create precarity, leading to mental and physical suffering, and how these processes impact democratic stability. His book, The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, which won the Bases 2021 Book Award, examines how working-class dislocation and elite co-optation foster illiberalism in Hungary. Dr. Scheiring, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you very much for having me.
You served as a member of parliament for Hungary during Viktor Orbán's rise to power in 2010 to 2014. And you've recently posted an essay where you discuss various similarities between Orbán's regime and Donald Trump and his group. Can you tell me a bit about your experiences in Hungary? What was it like under 14 years? What was it like originally? What was it like under 14 years of Orbán's regime? Contrast the difference.
So I was an MP for 4 years between 2010 and 14. This is when Viktor Orban was elected back to power. And then I sort of left Hungary around 2016. So I don't have direct experience about living in Hungary anymore, but this already tells you the life chances of a person like me in a country like Hungary. It was not my original plan to relocate or move abroad or leave my home country. So in 2010, Orbán took power with a very detailed agenda that he didn't talk about before the elections. No one really knew what he was planning, but it was very clear from day one on that he has this legislative shock therapy prepared, a slew of fast-moving legislations and very confrontative steps, nominating loyalists throughout the independent state institutions, inviting friendly oligarchs, business person to various formal and informal political elite and government positions, and introducing a set of laws that from very early on combined basically economic policy, social policy, economic nationalist version of those policies with a gradual shift, a gradual but relatively rapid shift towards an ever more authoritarian form of government. So from very early on, we had to fight on multiple fronts, I can say that. There were these very regressive social and economic policies that benefited mostly the higher income Hungarians. It's very much like Trump's agenda to reduce taxes. One of his very first policies was to reduce personal income tax for high income earners. But at the same time, he was also introducing all these administrative tweaks to how independent institutions are run, from the constitutional court to like stuffing whatever institution you can imagine with loyalists. So there was a lot of things happening at the same time. We were pretty much overwhelmed by what was going on. And it was also very clear early on that this system that they are building is really like it's a wall between opposition MPs, just regular people, and the governing elite. There's no way to get through. So I remember, for example, one day as a kind of symbolic protest, we hired this machine, this bulldozer kind of thing, because we had a budget proposal, like an alternative budget proposal, how to manage the state's finances, with detailed, breakdown of what to spend on and whatever. And normally you would discuss this in parliament, but there was no chance to have any meaningful discussion. So symbolically, we rented this bulldozer and drove it to the parliament and kind of delivered our alternative proposal with that, because the idea is that you really need this kind of bulldozer to get through this illiberal wall that shields Viktor Orbán's power. And it has just gotten stronger, his grip on power, ever since. He just a couple of days ago, he introduced again changes to the electoral law, reducing the number of seats in Budapest, classic gerrymandering. Budapest leans towards the opposition, and he increases a bunch of the number of seats in a bunch of rural areas where Viktor Orbán's party, Fidesz, is highly popular. So that's just a very easy administrative way of making the life of the opposition harder. So I guess I could continue with all these things.
Yeah,
but
I mean, so political discourse has been squelched, and he's been in power for 14 years now. Has he been elected? Has there been electoral interference? Obviously, you're talking about gerrymandering, which is a obviously anti-democratic process. But have the Hungarian elections been above board, or has he been?
So the trick with these people like Orbán, these authoritarian populists or illiberal populists, is that they build their kind of illiberal authoritarian regimes from within the democratic system. So it's not like you see, I don't know, policemen or military kind of on the street and blocking you from exercising your right to vote. It's not like that.
Okay.
It's kind of a more subtle, from gerrymandering to controlling the media. In Hungary, we have this European system where you have a public broadcasting that reaches a significant population. So he interfered how that is managed, transforming it basically into state propaganda. But he also has this friendship system with friendly oligarchs who helped Orban get elected, and in return, Orban helps them get richer and richer. And then they also use some of this money that they get from the state to buy up, for example, local media. Like, for example, local tabloids. They are so important for many people outside the big cities. They would first look at these local tabloids. They are all owned throughout the country by someone affiliated with Fidesz or close to Fidesz. So that's just, again, one way of interfering in a political competition in a way that makes the life of the opposition significantly harder. He's also, tinkering with the kind of the institutional landscape, attacking civil society, making the financing of civil society group harder and harder. And this is a bit like, just recently there was this infamous House bill that was framed as a terrorist financing bill in the US Congress. But then many argue, I think rightly so, that the idea that Republicans have with that is that it would empower Trump to clamp down on kind of non-profit organizations that he doesn't like. And you have similar legislation in Hungary, but also in Russia, where the state or the government, the executive, has this power to kind of interfere in the lives of NGOs. He's making the life of trade unions much harder, change the labor code multiple times. So it's much harder to organize for labor movements, it's much harder to go on strikes. It's basically impossible if you are a state public service employee, but it's also much harder even just if you are a simple private service employee. And even though if you are a member of a labor union, it's just much harder to organize. So all these things. Then he's also cutting. Again, this is the European system where political parties receive state funding, so as not to depend on oligarchs, at least in theory. But if you have a party like Fidesz, it has a lot of financial resources from these oligarchs, notwithstanding the state financing. However, the opposition groups, they pretty much depend on these state public resources. And you have the same system in Germany. Most of political and financing comes from state, and it depends on your electoral results. But of course, if you have a reckless authoritarian government in power who controls the parliament, then you can change that system as well. So he's cut funding for political parties. He's imposed these extremely hefty punitive fines on opposition parties, which basically created this bankruptcy situation for political opposition parties. And then, of course, Fidesz is also using the state budget to run political campaigns. So he would use state governmental expenditures to just simply finance campaigns that are completely in overlap with Fidesz's or Viktor Orbán's political messages. And the money that is available to Fidesz to do that is just not comparable to the finance.
Of course, without an independent media able to hold them to the question, or an independent judiciary able to block this, you basically have you've basically lost all methods of stopping it.
Exactly. So the judiciary, I would say, is also trying to interfere there, kind of forcing judges to retire, but still that's the last kind of system that works more or less well in Hungary, the judicial system. But the problem is that you have a democratically elected illiberal government, so they are writing the law. So there's really sort of very little that you can do legally. And I think this is also, if you look at the legal strategies that that European elites had against Viktor Orbán, they were not effective. And this reminds me of this strategy to go after Donald Trump through litigation.
Yes. Let's compare the similarities here. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarity, as you said in your essay, between the U.S. and Hungary. But many in the U.S. believe that, with its visionary constitution and focus on the pillars of liberty and democracy, that it's exceptional. There's this exceptionalism in the U.S. that makes people feel that they aren't. Hungary was under the influence of the Soviet Union very recently, and folks might discard this as different at the basis, that people would not accept it like they might have in Hungary. Can you address that?
So, on the one hand, I want to say that the US system is indeed much more robust. And I think it's important to say this because I've talked to so many Americans these days, and a lot of them are really, really deeply worried. And I just want to say that it's not likely that the US would end up like Hungary in the next few years, because the system is much more decentralized. You have many more veto points. You have states, you have local governments. Also, congressmen and senators are relatively more independent from their parties, although Donald Trump is trying to kind of change that. But it's a different system. In a first-past-the-post system, representatives have relatively more autonomy compared to the proportional system, where the fate and political career of politicians, representatives, is directly controlled by the political party to which they belong. So there are these differences that make it harder for Trump or the Republican Party to transform the US along Hungarian lines. However, I do think they are deeply inspired by the Hungarian model, and they are very frank about it and very open about the desire to mimic as much as possible the Hungarian model. If you take the example of this infamous Project 2025, which of course Trump said that it's just like it's a bunch of weirdos who authored that, it has nothing to do with that. But now we see with his nominations that it's very much the Project 2025 playbook that he's following, right? And the chairman of the Heritage Foundation is really close to Viktor Orbán, and there is a direct communication and mutual learning going on between the Heritage Foundation and Hungarian politicians and political think tanks as well.
Wow.
J.D. Vance multiple times said that he thinks that Viktor Orbán did many things right. For example, the way he restructured Hungarian universities, basically reducing significantly academic freedom and interfering in the lives of universities. He said that it's something that the US should learn from. So, and then you could really look at multiple instances, but it's very clear that leading conservative thinkers and politicians have been paying close attention to the Hungarian model and want to implement as much from it as possible. There's also another similarity, which I think is very important to realize, and it's the kind of the demand for a radical break, not necessarily for an authoritarian turn, but something that is really new, this mass popular demand for that. And this is very much true, that was very much true around the end of the 2000s when Viktor Orbán broke through, and this is very much true in a contemporary US. But it's very much true in other countries in Western Europe, where you can see the illiberal radical right populist parties breaking through. That movement is also very often driven by people's desire to change course radically, and not necessarily just in terms of immigration, but also if you look at, for example, German real wages in Germany have been stagnating for decades among people who have no university degree. So you have this.
You claim in your book, your thesis is that the economic stress is at the root of acceptance of an authoritarian figure. I think many liberals in the U.S. are happy to believe that all of Trump's supporters are racist bigots, and sure that there's a small vocal minority that are racist bigots that are, that feel that the leash is off and they can express their opinions. But I think that is not the reason for this. I mean, that small minority has always existed. The fact that you have more than half of the voters voting for this leads to one to expect a significant motivator, and the economic stress is your thesis. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I fully agree with you that even though Donald Trump is clearly this racist messages, and he says really vile things, and many of his allies do that. It's simply impossible to explain the success of Trumpism and radical right populism just with reference to race, or even more broadly to identity politics. It's just not possible. If you look at even already in 2016, the Republican Party under the leadership, so to say, of Donald Trump has made significantly more gains among Black Americans than among whites. The same happened now in just this election. The Republican Party has made huge inroads among Black and Latino Americans, and also other ethnic and racial minority populations. So it's just, you cannot explain that they all did this because they are somehow racist. It's just not true. I think the reason is that many of these minority groups also tend to be overwhelmingly working class. They not of course, not all of them, but you have many of them who are lower income Americans. And they feel their voice is not heard. They feel that the Democratic Party or liberals are paying too much attention to educated people like us, and they don't really care about the plight, about the real suffering of these people. One of my research projects is on the deaths of despair in the United States, comparing it to a very similar health shock that took place in Eastern Europe, leading to increased suicides and deaths from alcohol. In the US, you have also huge drug problems. But again, there's this really interesting and largely unexplored parallel how economic shocks, deindustrialization, these things lead and feed into these destructive health behaviors. So there is very real physical and mental suffering among these lower income Americans and Eastern Europeans. And it's just, I think, very irresponsible to neglect this and to say that this is all kind of your fault, or to say that this is because you are a racist or you lack cognitive ability. You can find all these explanations why this is going on. And this is why these people say, and I would say rightly so, that liberal elites are kind of uncaring. So who will then, represent my interest? Then they see that these radical right populists are really going, at least verbally, against the system. They are much better at symbolically siding with lower income citizens. If you look at how Donald Trump is behaving, even though he's a billionaire, he's always ready to, when Biden talks about this with his garbage remark, then Trump immediately sat into the garbage truck. He went to work in the McDonald's. This is, of course, you could say that this is fake, but at the same time, it's also smart symbolic class politics, because it kind of positions Trump as a friend of the people. So I think that's something that is really important, and it's not exceptional to the U.S.
With all of this,
to Hungary, it's really a big problem with this kind of liberalism.
With all of this positioning going on of the right-wing authoritarian figures being the friend of the populace. How did that turn out for the little guy in Hungary? Can you contrast the living situation of the working class in Hungary now as to before Orban's rise? Has it been good for them?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. So there's no simple answer for that. On the one hand, Orban was very lucky until relatively recently. So basically before the COVID crisis, but especially until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The economic situation was relatively better. There even was a rebound after the COVID lockdowns. So let's say throughout the 2010s, after the recovery of the financial crisis, this part of Central Europe was really booming economically. You had a lot of German and other Western European investors looking for investment opportunities in East Central Europe. Mm-hmm. Wages are lower than in Western Europe, so they would relocate to kind of regain their international competitiveness. That brought a lot of new investments. You saw all these new car companies investing in Hungary and in many other countries.
So globalization was helping.
Exactly. So you had this kind of massive inflow of foreign investment in the 2010s. And then Orban was also benefiting a lot from direct European Union subsidies that flew in, especially by the end of the 2010s. They became very, very important. So you had these external kind of things, processes, and resources that really helped Hungary and many other countries in the region to grow economically. So that's important to see because it led to a massive increase in wages in the 2010s. Orban also did a few things that helped some of the working class electorates. So, for example, he increased the minimum wage just enough, not by a lot, but just enough so that he can say that I'm a friend of workers. Okay. He also, at least rhetorically, in the early 2010s, attacked, for example, banks. And this is just a few years after the financial crisis, when people, were seeing that politicians are saving the banks, but who is saving the simple folks? So attacking banks was a popular position. So he was really clever with these kind of strategic or tactical policies, taxing banks and things like that. Mm-hmm. But at the end, if you look at really who is the most important winner financially, then it's the upper income citizens and businesses. Because he gave just enough to workers so that they believe that Orban is their friend, and because the economic growth due to these mostly external processes was relatively healthy, he had the money to actually do that, but he kept wage growth below the level of regional economies. So whereas around the middle of end of the 2000s, Hungary was, I think, around 6th or 7th from the bottom in the OECD in the value of the real wage. Now it's around position number 2 from the bottom. So it's basically the real wage is one of the lowest.
So it's eroded the real wages of the workers.
Exactly. So it has grown, but not so much as it has grown in many other countries like Romania or Slovakia, where wages were even lower than in Hungary, but now those countries took over. So that's a kind of tricky situation. So I would say the easiest way to put it is workers are relative victims or relative losers of the regime, but because the economy was growing right until the end of the 2010s, that relative was still enough to make them believe that Orban is their friend, and combined with all the symbolic and discursive populist messaging and policies, this really helped Orban to consolidate his support among working class Hungarians.
So the liberal leadership has kind of failed to connect with the working class, which is under an economic stricture. They're very poorly off in a precarious situation, as you say. How has the liberal government failed to address that? maybe what should they have been doing? Is there anything that you could have envisioned that they did wrong, for example?
So, just to clarify, in the US, when you say liberal, in Europe, most people say socialist or social democratic. But let's use liberal as kind of left of center political for left of center political forces. And yes, the situation is exactly as you say, and this was already the case before Viktor Orbán took power, before even the financial crisis. They were the political party, or it was actually a governing coalition of a socialist and the liberal political party. They went the furthest with the kind of Tony Blair type economic liberal policies that really contributed to the financial crisis and the growing economic polarization, financial inequality, and growing precarity by the 2010s. So just to give you an example, the real wage in 2009 was only around 10% higher. The average real wage was only around 10% higher in 2009 than it was around 1980, way into the socialist times. So you have several decades without basically any significant real wage growth. And this is the average. And you have to factor in that the increase in income inequality in the 90s was the most rapid everywhere around the world in Eastern Europe. It started from a very low level, so comparatively speaking, it's still not as high as in, South Africa, or not even as high as in the US, but it started from a very low level. So we had a rapid, massive skyrocketing of inequalities. So that average real wage, which kind of stagnated at the level of the end of the 70s, you can get that, like, basically the bottom 60% was, I think, financially actually worse off with with the transition.
Even the median would be much worse off, I would think.
Yeah. And then you could add things like, under socialism, I don't want to protect that socialist regime, but just factually, people had access to public housing one way or the other. It was very unlikely that you would end up having to sleep on the street. It was easy to find a job. Everyone had a job. Healthcare was accessible to everyone. Education was free, even though not everyone had access to universities. It was working. You had public services throughout the country. And then with the transition, you have this cutback, disinvestment from the welfare state. So an increasing number of people have also significantly harder time to just secure a roof under their head. So that also created a very interesting generational dynamic, because older generations who managed to obtain housing under socialist years were relatively more kind of cushioned. But the younger generations, they're forced to take out loans. And it's very much like the US subprime crisis situation, where you have this housing bubble, a lot of people buying houses through these risky loans. Same happened in Hungary. People buying homes through these risky loans because that was their only way to secure their housing. But of course, the whole thing, as it collapsed in the US, a couple of years after that, it collapsed in Hungary. So that was a very, very dire situation for many people. So I'm just saying this because, just looking at the average wage growth, for example, many say, well, Eastern Europeans were doing relatively well with the transition. You're right in terms of the average GDP growth. But what's going on beyond that GDP growth? How is the gain distributed economically? Who is gaining? Who is losing? What is happening with household indebtedness? All these kind of the lived experience of the economy is really, really important. And I think this is also crucial because, if you look at the post-COVID recovery of the US economy, just by the GDP, was pretty impressive if you compare it to Europe. And yet you had many people complaining that their economic situation isn't good. So what was going on? Where there was a real living cost crisis in the US, mostly inflation, housing prices, So that's a difference between how an expert would look at the economy and then the lived experience of the economy. And that's, I think, something that liberals tend to have difficulty understanding. They go with the experts who tell them the economy is doing well, but then that's not how people experience the economy. And these illiberal populists, they don't really care that much about the experts, so they are much better at actually saying what people are experiencing or saying things that correspond to that kind of reality. And in many cases, there is a righteous anger there. And it's a very sad situation that it's only the right-wing populists are able to channel that anger because they use it for their own kind of power interests and not really to introduce beneficial reforms.
Yeah, I think weak leaders on all sides tend to lean into demonization of hated minorities to gain support. And for the right, it's the elites, and immigrants, and for the left, it's maybe all of the Republican supporters. I guess maybe not a minority anymore, though. How do you advise Americans in the present situation to prevent a similar collapse or loss of liberal democracy? What strategies are best to that have you've learned from your experience to oppose such a thing?
Yeah. So in this article, I use this metaphor of the hardware and the software of this kind of authoritarian populist takeover. And the hardware refers to all the institutional hijacking that we discussed, the media landscape, the gerrymandering, all these things. So one important thing is to fight back at this institutional level. So I mentioned the media, for example. There, it's really important to do everything to maintain the plurality of the media. But also, I think there's already a significant gap that liberals have in terms of accessing Americans in non-metropolitan areas. And the same happened in Hungary. The right was quietly buying up all the local newspapers. And so suddenly, liberals figured out that they can only talk to people in the biggest cities. And the others just have very little access to that kind of liberal messages. So if you know anyone with significant financial firepower, try to convince them to buy or build local tabloids. That's one of my things. I think local tabloids are so important. I really love investigative journalism, but
it's important
who does
for
that
democracy.
investigative journalism talk to? It's talking to us. It's really important because it can have a real influence, but that's really not how you get to the masses. So for that, you need a different kind of journalism. So that's just one example. If there's anything that you can do through the legal system, I think you should do that. I think especially in the US, there's always more room for litigation than in the case of Hungary. But again, the European case against Orban and also the Hungarian system shows that that's not the primary battlefield against this kind of authoritarian populism. Because on the one hand, they are making the laws, the regulations, so it's very hard to go after them through the legal system. On the other hand, they can always portray themselves as victims of these technocratic elites, unelected, judges or constitutional bodies. And that's just politically quite a lucrative position, so to say.
Sure.
So I would say
We've definitely seen that.
Yeah, exactly. So that can't be really the primary channel. Doing everything to protect the agency of labor unions, increasing the kind of the embeddedness of the Democratic Party in local labor union groups and increasing the cooperation there is really important, because that's where you can get to these lower income masses. And there's even research on that which shows, both in the US and also in Europe, that labor union membership acts as a kind of a protective factor against illiberal populism. So I think that's really important. And then there's this other side, the software all the
Right.
discourses and the positioning, the symbolic class politics that we also talked about. So I would say that's even more important to find the ways to find back there. And I think liberals tend to define democracy in very institutional terms. Like liberals like procedures, like institutions, which is fine. We need those institutions and procedures, but that's pretty distant from people. And I think this is also related to why liberal elites have this distaste to kind of populist kind of politics. Here I'm talking not the kind of right-wing populist, but just a more popular, more down-to-earth, more folksy kind of politics that talks about the issues that people really care about. You don't protect democracy by talking about the constitutional court. You protect democracy by taking up the problems that people care about. You protect democracy by protecting people against inequality or precarity and things like that. That's how you protect democracy. So I think for that, you need the kind of find the software that works against this authoritarian populist discursive machinery.
So narratives, basically countering populist narratives with facts and actual actual figures.
I would say, fact that's really, really crucial, because we can see that these right-wing populists have really an easy time just like bending reality the way they want. So I think that's really important. Also, as a researcher, I do think that trying to protect spaces for anything that is evidence-based discourses, evidence-based policies, that's really important. But also we need to go beyond that kind of, so it's not, unfortunately or not, politics is not clearly it's not simply a rational issue. So you need to be able to also to connect people in terms of trust, like emotions, symbols, and that's just how people. When there's so much going on, when there's so much information, how do you filter information? There's theories about this in decision-making theory that it's actually rational to use these rules of thumb, to use these kind of symbols to kind of filter out information. And this is why populism works, because it offers people these simplifying rules of thumb. Now the question is whether you can have much less harmful, much more progressive, simplifying rules of thumb that people can kind of relate to. So I think that's the kind of task ahead for progressives, and unfortunately, what we see not just in the US and not just in Hungary, but in general in Europe is that they very easily end up in this position where they are seen as the elites, protecting the procedures, protecting the institutions, and not really caring for people. So I think that you need to get out of those. You need to talk about the big issues that people care about. And that was a big problem with, I think, the latest campaign of the Democratic Party, that they kind of, not completely, but they didn't really double down on the big economic problems, that Americans are facing. And I think that's a real issue. Like, who is offering the hope of a radical renewal? I think the U.S. is.
I think they offered status quo to people who were being killed by the status quo.
Exactly. So and the U.S. is not the same U.S. as it was a couple of decades ago. I mean, I really love that country, but it's really disintegrating socially and economically, and it's really heartbreaking to see that. And it's really heartbreaking to see that happening to people. If you drive around in upstate New York, in West Virginia, many of these people, like, just look at what happened to West Virginia. That was a state that was solidly democratic, and now is the most hardcore red state that you can imagine. That's what happens when you just leave these people behind. So I think you need to kind of realize that there is this real suffering going on among low-income Americans. And it's not just white Americans. It's not a white working class problem, The Democratic Party don't have a white working class problem. They have a working class problem, and that's a crucial difference. That's why they lost a lot of Black and Latino voters.
So, thank you for giving us some insights into your experience and sharing the similarities that you see and some tools that people can use going forward to try to maintain democracy over authoritarianism. Do you have any parting wisdom or predictions you'd like to make as to where things are going in the near future?
I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. Both on the Eastern European side, many people used to think that Eastern Europe is just so exceptional. Also on the American side, many still think that the US is so exceptional. But you can see all these similarities, all the structural problems, also in Western Europe, that are really harming liberals who are not prepared to break away from their old ways of doing politics. So that's why I think it's really important to have this kind of, if you want, cross-Atlantic dialogue about the social roots of radical right populism. But if I can stress one thing is I use the term despair. That's of despair. So you should not despair though, because there is room to fight back. Really, the American system is more decentralized. So although the Democratic Party is in big trouble. But is in not such a big. That trouble is not so big as the trouble that the liberals in Hungary were facing. Now there is a big opposition party that has recently emerged, but it's another right-wing party. So we have a kind of soft right-wing populist party led by a guy, as a smart fellow, but he was just until a year or 2 years ago, a strong ally of Viktor Orban. He was working in the background for the state. He just dropped out, and now he has this new kind of center-right, slightly populistic political party that is the main challenger of Fidesz. You also have a very strong radical right party that is even more far to the right than Fidesz, and the erstwhile strong left liberal parties are just shrunk to an unrecognizable minority, and they only basically survive in the biggest cities in the country through local governments. So that's a warning sign, and American liberals have still time to avoid that fate. But it's better to get prepared for why this is happening, and I think there needs to be substantive change across this spectrum that we talked about.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us on The Rational View today. Gabor, thank you, and good luck.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.